Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Nate. And thank you so much to the conference organizers for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be part of this conference, and I look forward to hearing all of the other papers that we have today. So I'm going to go for a little bit of an unconventional way of thinking about performing magic. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that as I go through my talk, which is entitled, I Don't Want Realism, I Want Magic, Fantasy as Resistance in the Later Íslendingasögur. My title comes from scene 9 of the American playwright Tennessee Williams' 1947 play, A Streetcar Named Desire. The play revolves around Blanche Dubois, an aging and now penniless Southern belle who moves into an apartment in New Orleans with her sister, Stella, and her husband, Stanley. In scene 9, Blanche is confronted by her new suitor, Mitch. Stanley has informed Mitch that Blanche is older and more sexually experienced than she professed. Horrified, Mitch demands to know why she refuses to be seen in the light, why he has, quote, never had a real good look at her, end quote. He insists on turning on the light, on being realistic, to which Blanche retorts, quote, I don't want realism, I want magic. Yes, magic. I try to give that to people. I misrepresent things to them. I don't tell the truth. I tell what ought to be the truth. Don't turn the light on, end quote. Mitch ignores her pleas and turns on the light. He does not like what he sees. Deciding that he can no longer marry her, he declares, quote, I was a fool enough to believe you was straight, end quote. Blanche does not deny the queerness that Mitch ascribes to her. Instead, she asks, quote, who told you I wasn't straight, end quote. I begin with this scene to illustrate the intersection between queerness and magic, as well as the desire for alternative relationalities inherent to both. Blanche seems to long for an alternative to the world that she finds around her, a desire that perhaps resonates with what the philosopher Frederick Supa identifies as the central theme in Williams' plays. Supa proposes that most of Tennessee Williams' work, quote, especially A Streetcar Named Desire, focus on struggles with homosexuality in a very straight society, end quote. However, in this passage, Blanche seems not to voice a struggle with homosexuality, but rather with the struggle of a queer in a straight world. In this scene, Blanche perhaps stands for, as J.C. Hubert claims, quote, sexual outcasts in general, and notably gay men, end quote. His argument contends that her desire for magic, rather than realism, is the lament of a grieving drag queen, drawing from earlier readings of Blanche as occupying a distinctly queer but sympathetic position, despite her characterization as an ostensibly cisgender and heterosexual woman. Departing from a straight reading of the play affords considering how Blanche embodies and expresses queer feelings. If, as Huibert suggests, quote, her theatrics are the camp-resistant strategies of the lone gay man in a straight world, end quote, this casts her desire for magic as a particularly queer gesture. When Blanche Dubois cries out for magic, she implies that the real world, a straight world, has failed her. In the 1990 drag adaptation of Streetcar, Belle Reprieve, Stella says as much, reminding a drag queen Blanche that, quote, as gays and women, realism works against us, end quote. But what is the alternative? Blanche suggests that magic potentiates never possibility, what ought to be the truth rather than what is. A Streetcar Named Desire invites considering magic as both a queer means of critique and refusal, but also a way of imagining alternatives to the dominant social order. Turning from mid-century New Orleans to pre-modern Scandinavia, how might this understanding of magic illuminate the potential of magic and its performance in medieval Iceland? In particular, I want to think about the ways that the Íslendingasögur might, like Blanche, refuse realism. The 12th and 13th century Íslendingasögur are often lauded for their realism, specifically the ways in which these texts depict the farming and feuding community of 9th and 10th century Iceland. Traditionally, scholars have viewed the evolution of saga genres as a decline of realism. From this perspective, these supposedly more realistic sagas develop into their more fantastical post-classical counterparts after the collapse of the independent Icelandic Commonwealth in 1262-1264. even if, as Eleanor Rosamond Barraclough observes, quote, a more fluid interpretation of the development of saga genres, end quote, has replaced the so-called decline of realism, the post-classical sagas are still suffused with magic. These sagas may not be more fantastical than their classical counterparts, as the latter are also riddled with prophecies, ghosts, trolls, and magic. But that does not undermine asking how the post-classical sagas employ their fantastic elements. This is a different consideration than who performs magic and what kind. That said, the post-classical sagas attest to many different magical practices. Dream interpretations in Fonboya saga, Weber magics that hinder the heroes of Viglundar saga and Greta saga, abjurations that protect the heroes of Guttlþora saga or Kilnessinga saga, hauntings and curses that terrorize the people of Bavafa saga, Havafa saga, Halvafar saga, Greta saga, and Svartdela saga, to name a few. This question is also not about whether the likely medieval audience believed in these multitudinous forms of magic and the supernatural or quasi-supernatural beings such as berserks, blaumen, dragons, and revenants that accompanied them. Rather, I follow Johanna Katrin Friviksdottir, who stresses that in the Íslendingasögur, quote, magic is fictionalized and fulfills a literary purpose rather than documents historically authentic pagan religious practice, end quote. Even if the fantastic exists across the Íslendingasögur, Lucy Karaka proposes that the post-classical sagas work with the supernatural, quote, more systematically than the classical texts, and they follow specific narrative principles which are meaningful in a literary perspective as well as in a social context, end quote. Along with Rebecca Merkelbach, who we have speaking with us later today, wonderfully, she furthermore criticizes the supposition that these later sagas, as a consequence of the collapse of the Commonwealth, turn away from social concerns. Both Karaka and Merkelbach observe that it is a mistake to believe that, as Karaka puts it, quote, a consciously fictional literature could not also represent a conceptualization of significant social issues, end quote. Irrespective of whether these texts are more magical than other Íslendingasögur, perhaps the fantastic and magical provides a way for the post-classical sagas to navigate contemporaneous anxieties, including perhaps voicing queer struggles in the present. My discussion consequently revolves around several questions. How might these sagas, like Blanche, substitute magic for realism, and for what reason? Do the post-classical sagas use their magic to communicate a dissatisfaction with the present? And in what ways might magic offer a particularly queer escape from a straight world? Simply put, do these sagas use magic as a way to resist an exit from a world that is not enough? And if so, how? To think about the magical, critical possibilities of the post-classical sagas, I want to put these texts into dialogue not only with Blanche du Bois, but also with the late great queer theorist Jose Esteban Munoz. In the definitive Cruising Utopia, Munoz argues that, like Blanche, queerness, quote, rejects a here and now and insists on potentiality or concrete possibility of another world, end quote. Munoz argues that a, quote, queer utopian impulse, end quote, or gesture, quote, promises another time and place and lets us imagine a space outside of heteronormativity to conceptualize new worlds and realities. Utopia offers us a critique of the present, of what is, by casting a picture of what can and perhaps will be, end quote. Anchored by a pivotal scene in the 14th century Kokoref saga, this talk moves between the post-classical sagas and medieval law to consider first how magic and queerness intersect in the medieval Icelandic imagination. From there, I turn to Munoz and Gunnar saga to propose that magic as a literary device encodes a queer utopian impulse that refuses what is and instead imagines an alternative. To conclude, I ponder whether the sagas, by telling tales of magic, don't tell the truth, but tell what ought to be the truth. To begin this discussion, I want to ask yet another question. How is the world of the sagas straight? Is the world of the sagas straight? The post-classical sagas, like most Íslendingasögur, primarily take place in Iceland. Like their classical counterparts, the post-classical sagas frequently begin and recount the settlement of Iceland by disaffected Norwegians. Other than these Norwegian prologues and brief or extended episodes abroad, usually in Norway, The primary setting of the post-classical sagas is Iceland and the farmsteads established by the original landnámsmenn, the settlers, or their descendants. Before thinking about departures from this setting, I want to suggest that there is a straightness to how the post-classical sagas imagine Iceland within, or magic within Iceland. Even if the Íslendingasögur more or less realistically depict the environments of early medieval Iceland, supernatural occurrences and magical activities nevertheless pervade accounts of the island. Yet, even if the supernatural is a recurrent phenomenon in the post-classical sagas, these texts also hint that the performance of magic, benevolent or otherwise, is a policed practice in pre-modern Scandinavia. The policing of magic in this world, as suggest, intersects with the policing of queerness. To consider the intersection between magic and queerness in the sagas, I want to first briefly outline the heteronormative and specifically heteromasculine milieu that the post-classical sagas describe and are composed within. In his recent monograph, Gareth Lloyd Evans describes the hegemonic masculinity that underlies social interactions and conventions in the Íslendingasögur. He argues that this model of masculinity, which is both relational and competitive, excludes and punishes men for any effeminacy. The boundaries of acceptable masculinity are policed by Niv and the closely related Iki, which are insults that, as Evan puts it, function like modern homophobia, quote, objecting from the normative masculine position, that which is seen as unmanly, end quote. Niv accused men of behaviors and identities collectively known as ergi, a term that encompasses gender nonconformance and penetrative and anal sex. Graugas, the laws of the Icelandic Commonwealth, punish the speaker of a Niv with outlawry, and further specify that there are 3 insults that permit a man to kill those who have uttered them: ragar, strovin, or sorðin. Ragar is a metaphysis of argar, the adjectival form of ergi, whereas strovin and sorðin are past participles of the verb streitha and sturta, respectively, both meaning to penetrate sexually. In both cases, strovin and sorðin means something like sexually used, or more colloquially, screwed or fucked. The severity of the punishments for saying a man has been fucked suggests that pre-modern Icelanders saw the behaviors that these insults allege as objectionable practices for men. Therefore, these laws, as well as the Niv themselves, define the boundaries of acceptable masculinity by invoking, quote, what a man must not be, since in that case, he is no man, end quote, and thus abject those who do not fall within these gendered norms. Turning to the post-classical Krókarefs saga helps to illuminate how medieval Icelanders used Niv to object the queer and potentially the magical from Iceland. The narrative recounts the arrival of the titular hero in Greenland and the growing hostility between him and his neighbors, Thorgils and his sons. These tensions culminate when Krókarefr avoids fighting a polar bear. The Thorgils sons, led by Þengetil Thorgilsson, kill the bear instead, but they see footprints from where Krókarefr fled. When they return to their father, Thorgils praises his sons for their hunt. In response, Þengetil issues a Niv against Krókarefr, issuing an insulting nickname Refr the Ragar. Since Ragar, or ergi, encompasses everything not straight, this slanderous byname may signify both queer and magical practice. According to Ármann Jakobsson, ergi signals, quote, everything unbecoming, villainous and deviant, incest, bestiality, homosexuality, the blurring of gender roles, aggressive female lust, shapeshifting, and sorcery, end quote. Through a close reading of the classical Gísla saga, Ármann argues that 13th and 14th century medieval Icelanders saw an intersection between supernatural creatures and non-normative sexuality, arguing that, quote, ergi is naturally entwined with tröllskapur, troll magic, in descriptions of magic, as both terms refer to an essential part of it. Like troll, ergi refers to something abnormal, magical, negative, and antisocial. Magic is thus ergi in that it is antisocial and evil, as well as queer. In magic, everything is upside down or inside out, and that can be described as ergi or tröllskapur, end quote. This affords considering how the threat of Niv polices the social world of Krókarefs saga, and whether Þengetil enforces a model of masculinity that is both straight and non-magical, that is, as Evans notes, quote, internalized by male characters, end quote. To depart briefly from Kokoref's saga, the post-classical sagas illustrate how the limits of acceptable magical practice, like masculinity, is policed through injurious remarks and legal practice. Íslendingasögur, for example, relates that the matriarch Esja appears to use magic benignly to protect her foster son Bui, a nearly Christian hero, from attack by pagan Icelanders. Nevertheless, the saga suggests that this magical display is disconcerting. The assailants, repelled by her magic, refer to Esja and her foster son as Thrul. This injurious remark perhaps hints that the saga recognizes that even if Esja acts benevolently, her magical practices are potentially transgressive and queer. According to the personal rights section of the 13th century Norwegian Gulathing law, calling someone a troll is slander, demanding full compensation. Furthermore, these laws prohibit referring to someone as either troll eða fordeithu, a troll or a sorcerer, an equation that gestures towards the overlap between troll and magician, also attested in such terms as totalskálpur, which we saw earlier, or totaldomur. These stipulations also hint at the intersection of queerness and magic. The regulation prohibiting calling a man a troll or a sorcerer is listed alongside rulings for slanders that imply gender nonconformance or aberrant sexual practice, such as the accusation that a man has given birth to a child, have a barn boret, or that he has been a prostitute, a porkona. This affords considering that that abject homosexuality, also abject magical practices, and vice versa. Turning to Graugas, the law code of Commonwealth era Iceland, the secular laws do not discuss witchcraft, but the church law section does. However, after the end of the Commonwealth and the institution of Norwegian rule, new laws were introduced, first with Jónsíða circa 1275, and then Jónsbók circa 1280, the latter of which is contemporaneous with the composition of Íslendingasögur and most other post-classical sagas. 4 manuscripts of Jónsbók list fordeitha, sorcerer, as a slanderous term, and with stipulations around injurious poetic composition allow for suits to be brought against anyone who claims that another practices fordeithuskap, witchcraft. Given that these laws indicate that even suggesting that somebody is a troll or sorcerer is an act that demands full compensation, this invites considering whether the prevailing attitude in later medieval Iceland was that being a troll or a sorcerer was unacceptable. In other words, does Íslendingasögur hint at the policing discourses that surround magical practice in pre-modern Scandinavia? The saga may portray Esja and her magic as benevolent, but this text may nevertheless hint that her behavior would be suspicious, either to her 9th century hecklers or to a later medieval audience. The post-classical sagas may invoke these laws to condemn those who use or benefit from magical practices, as is the case in Grettir's saga. The text describes how Thorbjorn Ungutul seeks to remove Grettir from his island hideout on Drengi, and he turns to his foster mother Þuríður for magical help. Þuríður invokes a powerful hex on Grettir and alters the weather so that her foster son can reach the inaccessible island. Grettir, already wounded from a cursed log sent by Þuríður, is no match for Thorbjorn Ungutul. Even though Grettir was an outlaw, Thorbjorn Ungutul is not celebrated for his slaying. Instead, he is widely condemned for killing the outlaw because the saga claims that Thorbjorn had done a shameful deed by killing a nearly dead man, and because he did it with sorcery. Thorbjorn is later charged at the Ulthing for sorcery and witchcraft, which had caused the death of Grettir, and also because he had killed a half-dead man. Given that the sorcery is what led to the feeble condition of Grettir, the charges against Thorbjorn seem to punish him for his use of magic more than anything else. The saga reports that because of these charges, Thorbjorn was outlawed, and the saga reports that it was then made law that all sorcerers would be made outlaws, likely referencing the stipulation against sorcerers in the Christian section of the Graugas laws. However, given the time that Grettir saga was probably composed after the institution of Jónsbók, this reference may also correspond to these later legal restrictions on the practice of magic, whether fordeithuskap or vekja troll upp, waking trolls up, because these activities were seen to encourage unchristian beliefs, as Jónsbók claims that magic comes from heathenry. These prohibitions suggest that magic has no place within Christian society, and attempt to exclude magic from that realm. This perspective seems to have influenced the world of the sagas, whether the pre-Christian society described by Íslendingasögur and Krókurefs saga, or the post-conversion world of Grettir. Shameful words and the law may police the boundaries between the human and the magical, and perhaps the queer along with it. Returning to Krókurefs saga reveals how shameful words may enforce realism as well as gendered boundaries. After bestowing a shameful nickname upon Rethur, Fengital said many offensive words about him. When Fengital asks his father if he knows Rethur in Ragi, Thorgils offers a slanderous explanation for how Krókurefr came to settle in Greenland that reiterates the connection between gender nonconformance and magical practice. He relates that Rethur was expelled from Iceland because he was not in nature like other men. Rather, he was a woman every ninth night and needed a man, and thus he was called Rethur the Ragar, and stories spread of his horrible deeds. Thorgils' use of Ragar and his allegation that Krókurefr is a woman every ninth night echoed the descriptions of injurious remarks in Gulathingslög. These laws suggest that it is a knave to claim that a man is a woman every ninth night. The insult in the saga hints both at the potentially magical practices and queer desires, since Rethur needs a man. The saga furthermore hints that Iceland cannot tolerate such behavior, since after Thorgils tells his tale, his sons, quote, created this slander and spread it to all, that Rethur had been sent away from Iceland and been paid a certain fee to do so because of his ergi, end quote. Neve are symbolic abjections, which means that, as Predman Mulik Grakt Sorensen argues, the charges do not refer to actual deeds. Krókurefs saga, for example, emphasizes that the Thorgilsons produced the story, Bera Up, of Krókurefr's ergi. Outside of the slander, the saga never describes Krókurefr transforming into a woman or desiring men. Thus, these remarks likely do not refer to actual occurrences. The charge is symbolic. Yet, this charge nonetheless helps answer the question, is Iceland straight? Despite stressing that the slander is invented, Krókurefs saga nevertheless presents this as a plausible possibility, that someone would be paid to go away because of their ergi. Or rather, it would be plausible that Krókurefr would be paid to leave Iceland because of his queerness. Putting this in the language of Streetcar Named Desire, it is not foolish to believe that Iceland is straight. This is an island where men enforce masculinity in other men, and any queer shapeshifting is exposed and expelled. But what's the alternative? Even if the post-classical sagas reiterate the laws of the island and imagine violent outcomes against anyone who dares to suggest another is a troll, a shapeshifter, or a queer, the post-classical sagas may also hint at alternatives, both within Iceland and elsewhere. In Krókurefs saga, the slander of the Thorgilsons insinuates that Iceland does not tolerate the queer bodies and behaviors associated with ergi. But these remarks also intimate that Greenland does. Even if this account suggests that Krókurefr shames Greenland with his presence, since he is not like other men in his nature, this insult conveys that the landscape is, at the very least, a destination for bodies and behaviors that do not fit within the, quote, internalized rules of idealized masculinity, end quote, policed and enforced by Icelandic society. The injurious remarks in Krókurefs saga hint at the ambivalent position of Greenland in the Íslendingasögur. Though this slander imagines Greenland as an escape from institutionalized homophobia, this possibility is refuted by the fact that the Thorgilsons issued this need in Greenland. Put otherwise, even if the Íslendingasögur gesture towards Greenland as a space outside of heteronormativity, these slanderous discourses hint that Greenland is not truly outside of it. The Greenland that the Thorgilsons inadvertently point to is, to paraphrase Munoz, a queer utopia that is, quote, not yet here, end quote. Munoz theorizes that queer performances point towards the utopian by imagining and possibly constructing, quote, new worlds and realities that are not irrevocably constrained by the HIV/AIDS pandemic and institutionalized state homophobia, end quote. No comparable epidemic nor accompanying moral panic swept medieval Iceland. Yet this discussion shows that contemporary systemic homophobia has, as Evans puts it, quote, a medieval Icelandic counterpart in the discourse of Niamh, end quote. Even though the Thorgilssons issue a Niamh within Greenland, this space may nevertheless be construed as a world beyond these prevalent homophobic discourses. The Íslendingasögur, as well as the Fornaldarsögur, or the legendary sagas, imagine Greenland as populated with beings, bodies, and behaviors that disrupt gendered and sexual norms. When young men arrive in Greenland or other far northern or isolated climes, these youths often interact with the sexually aggressive, masculine, and endemic giantesses. Though these encounters have often been read as initiatory episodes, the unions between men and giantesses may unsettle the presumed masculinity of the adventurers and gesture towards a desire for an alternative relationality. The post-classical Gunnar saga includes one such episode, which also appears to varying degrees in Baba saga, Kjolnesinga saga, and Grethe saga, where the union between giantess and man may hint at a desire for an alternative, queerer mode of relationality. Gunnar saga departs from its narrative of feud in Iceland and moves to the magical land of Skugafjörður. Gunnar becomes lost on his way to Norway and eventually makes his way to the inlet I Helgelands og Bugthum in uninhabited Greenland. In Skugafjörð, Gunnar meets the giantess Vala, who unsettles the prevailing model of hegemonic Norse masculinity. The sexually forward giantess performs what Johanna calls a, quote, subversive womanhood, end quote, a way of being that is out of line with the, quote, traditionally female subservient roles, end quote, in the Norse literary material. As Vala and Gunnar's first meeting demonstrates, she is the sexual aggressor in their relationship, an attribute that Matthew Robbie argues is associated with masculinity, quote, activeness was predominantly associated with independent adult males, end quote. After Gunnar kills Vala's sister, she asks Gunnar to come home with her and begin their sexual relationship, commanding him to do so. Commanding him, come home with me, Gunnar, to my father's cave. The imperative form of fara, to go, stresses she initiates the relationship, and although Gunnar refuses her at first, he eventually relents to her second command. By submitting to the advances of the giantess, Gunnar may act in opposition to hegemonic Norse masculinity, which, as discussed, excludes and punishes men for any whiff of effeminacy, including subordination to women. As Robbie puts it, quote, sociosexual passiveness seems to have been associated in medieval Iceland with the unmasculine, most women, children, and the elderly, end quote. Despite initially refusing her advances, Gunnar submits to Vala's sexual dominance and refers to her as his vinkona, female friend, a compound that stresses the strength of their bond. Even though Vala's subversive womanhood threatens Gunnar's own masculinity, the text presents him as a willing participant in his relationship with the flagkona, the monstrous woman. Engaging with Munoz helps illuminate Gunnar's submission to Vala as a gesture towards alternative ways of being and loving, a gesture engendered by the queer effect of Skugafjörð. Approaching the artist Kevin Aviance, Munoz suggests that his drag performance disrupts the predominantly white, male, cisgender, and hypermasculine space of the New York City club scene through a, quote, unique cohabitation of traditional female and male traits, which is not only to be queer, but to defy troubling gender logics, end quote. Aviance enacts a critique of normative gender paradigms, quote, as well as the exclusionary logic it applies to people who do not make its normative cut, end quote. Aviance's critique originates with his inherently disruptive gender performance, which elicits discomfort as well as desire. Quote, Aviance permits the dancers to see and experience the feelings they do not permit themselves to let in. He performs all the emotions that the throng is not allowed to feel, end quote. Put differently, Aviance's performance generates utopia. In performing a hybrid disruptive gender, he allows for queer yearnings unthinkable within hetero or homo normativity. Returning to Gunnar's saga, perhaps submitting to a giantess would be unthinkable in Iceland, given the present and internalized threat of Niamh in the social world of the Íslendingasögur. Skugafjörð perhaps makes alternative ways of being and desiring possible. Relationships between giantesses and men invariably end when the adventurer leaves Greenland or shortly afterwards. If Relationships with masculine giantesses can occur in the far north, but not in the social landscape of Iceland. Do the Íslendingasögur suggest that something about this landscape permits these queer couplings? Greenland may offer space for these texts to explore alternatives to the models of masculinity and femininity that pervade the social landscape of the Íslendingasögur. By departing from his trajectory to Norway, a very normative trajectory in the sagas, Gunnar enters a space separate from hegemonic masculine ideals, a site that offers him the opportunity to express an alternative way of being and desiring without social ostracization. Whereas the queer utopia imagined Krokarev's saga only lives in rumor, Gunnar's saga hints at alternative possibilities that can be found, even if only for a moment, in a world of magic. To conclude, I want to return again to Aviance to consider the ways in which the post-classical sagas, through tales of magic, momentarily escape the policed relationalities of Iceland and gesture towards more utopian possibilities. Munoz argues that Aviance, with gestures that move between femininity and masculinity, opens up new worlds that elicit discomfort but also pleasure for his homonormative audience. Quote, imagine the relief these gym queens feel as Aviance lets himself be both masculine and feminine, as his fabulous and strange gestures connote the worlds of queer suffering and the pleasures of being swish and queenie that they cannot admit to in their quotidian lives, end quote. Maybe the post-classical sagas, by departing from Iceland, imagining other ways of being and loving, imagine an alternative to the society depicted in most Íslendingasögur and contemporary Iceland. As previously argued, Krokarev's saga and Gunnar's saga hint at the possibility that Greenland offers freedom from Iceland's self-policing masculinities and allows for disruptions to acceptable behaviors and desires. Perhaps these sagas, by moving away from the realism, enable moments of magic where the saga audience can imagine the pleasures of being swish and queenie. What would it be like to transform every ninth night into a woman? What would it be like to be with a giantess? The sagas raise these possibilities, but only momentarily. Krokarev's saga recounts that Refr takes vengeance on the Thorgils sons for their words, reaffirming that to be seen as a shapeshifter, to have queer desires, is a slight. The saga affirms that Refr had Oslelia quickly avenged that slander and perhaps reclaimed whatever masculinity he had lost. Likewise, Gunnar's saga does not allow its queer possibilities to last. Even though his relationship with Vala problematizes his masculinity, as Johanna stresses, this coupling must end. She must either be, quote, abandoned for a more appropriate partner or humanized and subjugated, transformed into a princess, end quote. Vala does not become any of these things, and he abandons her. The saga seems to suggest that Vala is unsuited for the human world, and potentially that she cannot be part of the straight world. After staying with Vala for the winter, he tells her that Mau thikkimer af vitya mana mina. It seems to me to be time to visit my men, rejoining the appropriate homosocial community and abandoning his queer companion. These moments of alternative relationality in a space outside of heteronormativity are perhaps what Munoz refers to as, quote, utopian breaks in the narrative, deviations from the text's dominant mode of narration, end quote. Even if these sagas ideate a disruptive gender performance, envision a queer configuration of the social, in short, imagine magic and the pleasures of being swish and queenie, these possibilities are ultimately refuted as the saga returns to quotidian lives. The moment of magic does not last for Blanche either. After her heated conversation with Mitch, a streetcar named Desire recounts that Blanche retreats into her imagination, telling lies to herself or perhaps performing magic. She dreams of a new lover or maybe an old flame, one that provides an escape from a world of realism that is hostile towards her. She imagines a man that will take her away from her sister Stella and nefarious brother-in-law Stanley. No man comes. After Stanley assaults her, Blanche tells her sister Stella, who does not believe her. In the final scene of the play, Stella sends Blanche against her will to a sanatorium. Stanley rips apart the paper lantern that cast Blanche in shadow and allowed her to perform her magic, to pass as a woman who can love and be loved by a man. Yet, even if Blanche's spell ends and ends violently, the play, for a moment, allows for this moment of magic, providing an exit not only from the dominant mode of narration, but also from a dominant social order. These moments of magic are fleeting, whether in the post-classical Íslendingasögur or in Streetcar, but perhaps these texts perform a bit of magic themselves, offering a, quote, anticipatory illumination of queerness, end quote, that, like a queer utopia, is not here, not yet. Thank you so much.